Well, let's get started here. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is Matt Myrick, for those who don't know, and I'll be your host today. A familiar face is Joseph Nelson, president of Stewardship Investments, and a not so familiar face is Mark Bertelrud, who is a guest speaker today. Mark is a father, a grandfather, a husband, but also has 38 years of healthcare experience. And we are very, very privileged to have Mark joining us today to discuss elder care needs. And before I get going here, I want to just go over the agenda really quick. Let me move my slide here. There's going to be three sections to the interview today. One is supporting your aging parents. Then there's preparing yourself and your spouse well. And then there's empowering the next generation, right? Your kids, for helping you in that season of life. So very good. Let's get, and then lastly, but not least, there will be a Q&A at the end. So feel free to jot down your questions throughout the webinar. There will be a time to post them in the chat at the end. So very good. Okay. Well, let's start on that first topic, supporting your aging parents. And this question goes to Mark. Mark, what are some signs to look out for that may indicate it is time to start discussing additional care or intervention for an aging loved one?
Yeah, Matt, thanks for the question and for the opportunity to join you today. So there's really a couple things you can do to begin to get a handle on that. And one is to listen very carefully, and the other is to watch very carefully. If you listen, you're going to start to perhaps hear some language with that person that's a little bit different, describing some things that used to be really routine that are now becoming a little bit more of a challenge.
Hey, Mark, if I can just stop you for a second there, we have a little bit of an audio problem being able to hear you.
I apologize for that.
No problem.
Does that make it better or still the same?
I can hear you, but it's very faint.
I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem. Very good. We'll shift the next question over to Joe while Mark is working through his tech problem. So, Joe, what would you say some key preparations are that families should consider when getting to the point where you would be transitioning a loved one who is at the end of life and they're getting to move into hospice care? Would you mind sharing with everybody what that would look like, and what should be some conversations leading up to that point?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. We're kind of skipping to the end of the series here when we talk about hospice and the end of life. But I know from my personal experience, my parents have passed away now, and hospice was just a really wonderful organization that came in and helped us, not only with the physical pain management, but they were just a great sounding board, a communication system between everyone involved. And my only regret is that we didn't call them in earlier. And I think it's maybe hard to recognize the end is near and you keep putting that off. But I think having the hospice come in and help us to look for signals, because they've done this, been down the road many times. They can identify issues to be dealt with, keeping the loved one comfortable, helping them think through last wishes, and just really just making the whole situation easier to handle for everyone involved. So I guess that's my number one thing is don't hesitate to call in hospice when you know it's right.
Very good. That's insightful. Mark, are you back? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I apologize. Am I better?
You're yes. Perfect. Very good.
Awesome.
Sorry
about that.
Good.
So back to that question about kind of looking at some of those indications that it might be time. So I think I was kind of at that point of just listening and watching, because you may hear some language changes of, describing things that were routine that are a little more difficult. You may start to hear things about the number of people that you were unaware of that are actually coming by to help do and accomplish different tasks. And that can all be really good things. But unless it's tied together, it might kind of hide that there's a decline happening. And then just watching for activities. If there's a pretty significant routine around meals or bathing or social situations, and if those things start to change, that can be an early indication that there's some things happening that might at least be looking for a little more attention.
Oh, very good. Mark, what advice do you have for those who are preparing to have challenging conversations with their aging loved ones about sensitive topics like driving, living arrangements, and the potential for additional care? Where do you start with that?
Yeah, the place I would start is just whoever's involved in that discussion, whether it's adult children, just other important people in the lives of that senior who might be ready or not ready for those conversations, is keep that person in the very middle of all of those conversations and in all the planning for that, because it's very easy to begin to talk around that person and begin to solve the issues and lay out the scenarios, almost as if they're not there. And although that
Mm.
can be effective, it usually turns into more of a parental approach rather than kind of collaborative. And so I think really that's probably the biggest part, is just to be prepared. If there's more than one person, try to get on the same page as you begin to have those conversations. It can be very difficult to kind of have wide varieties of opinions coming out at the same time if it's family members who are not on the same page. But again, I would just default back to that. Keep that senior in the middle of the planning. Think about what they would want to have if they're expressing their needs, or if they're having a hard time expressing, to be able to kind of think back to things that they've talked about in the past, or things that they may have indicated would be their desires at this point.
Mm, very good, Mark. That's insightful. How can a person determine if they are in a position to care for their aging parents? When is it necessary to seek outside assistance?
Yeah, that can be a tough one, because there are just a wide variety of situations that can influence that. But a few things that are significant. One is just personalities, right? Some people are caregivers as family members, and it's easy to step into that role and to be able to do it personally rather than to be looking outwards. In other cases, and it's neither good nor bad, it just is, people are not as prepared to do that and are not as prepared to step in and become that caregiver, because it totally changes the relationship in many cases. And then there's just some practical things. What are work responsibilities? What are some of the things that maybe you have going on in your life that are either going to allow you to do that, or that may prohibit travel schedules, those kinds of things. And then even looking at past relationships. If there's a history of not having good family relationships, and if there are strains in that relationship, that can be very difficult in a caregiving situation. And so just to be aware of those things, and really looking at all of that. And then there just becomes some practical discussions as well, about money and finances. And some of those care choices are expensive. And so just kind of knowing whether you need to fill those roles personally as a practical thing, or whether there are options to have other people coming in and filling those needs.
Sure. Oh, very good. What advice would you offer to families who are currently deeply involved in caregiving at this point? What are some things to watch out for?
Yeah. This is a really good one, and kind of right off the top of my head, I'm going to say find a support network. And if that's built into the family, if that's neighbors and friends, because this can be, again, a very different role and a very mentally and physically challenging role. And a lot of times what we see is when seniors are coming to our world, there may be a spouse or an adult child who has kind of had a significant impact on their own health, their own mental well-being, by providing services and for not taking care of themselves. And that's a very easy thing to do as you become so involved in doing the best for that loved one. It's pretty easy to overlook kind of your own issues. And a couple of other things related to that. If there's multiple family members that are involved in caregiving, communication is going to be a theme that comes up over and over in some of my responses today. And trying to get people on the same page as much as possible, because there's always scenarios that play out. It played out in my own family, where you have the adult child who lives next to mom and dad and is involved on a daily basis, a child who on a weekly basis is involved, and maybe more on the telephone than in person. And then there may be somebody involved who's a holiday visitor, or someone who is very uninvolved. And all of those different opinions can be very different. And again, if I look at my own family, my mom, I'll use her as an example right now. She has very different conversations with me as her youngest son than she does with my oldest sister. And so to be able to kind of put those things together and understand those differences and then be able to support whoever's involved in that caregiving through those situations can be really, really helpful.
That's a great example. So when you're to the point where you begin to look for a nursing home or an assisted living option for this loved one, what criteria should you be prioritizing when you do that shopping process?
Yeah. Couple of things, and I would tell you the first thing that I always recommend to people, regardless of how familiar the option may be, regardless if you know people who work there or not, is to gather as much firsthand experience as you can get. And so, whether that is talking to someone who has had a loved one that either currently or in the past has been cared for in that environment, to talk to them about their experience, to talk about the pros and cons. Again, a second piece of kind of that firsthand knowledge is, even if you're familiar with the building, I'll use Warroad as an example here. You know, we're a small town. Most people know all about Warroad Senior Living, but we still encourage people to come in, do a tour of the building, walk through the building. You just get a sense of kind of presence that you can't get in any other way. And you can hear the sounds, see the sights, smell the smells, all of those things, which can be really good indicators, or at least draw you into a next level of questions. And, you know, usually if you're looking at the faces of the people that are working there and or living there, you get a pretty good idea of kind of the environment and whether it's a content and happy and focused environment or whether there's some stressors. And, you know, that can lead you aside. Everybody has a bad day, but usually with kind of some combination of those things, you get some pretty good information. And then I would also say, you know, there certainly are trusted providers, whether they're doctors or nurses or people that are involved in either your own care or in the care of your senior loved one. They usually have a pretty good inside network in the healthcare community to know and to give you some pretty good advice there. And then probably, at least on my list, kind of the certainly not to be ignored, but the behind those things, there are some online resources from the state of Minnesota, from the federal government, that will do some quality ratings. And those are not to be diminished, but again, using my own place here as an example, I've been here 8 years and we have, I think, delivered consistently really good, strong quality care. If those firsthand experiences would be consistently good, we've slid up and down the scale at times from those governmental ratings because that could be related to policies and procedures and things that are more administrative and don't necessarily have a high impact on the actual care that your loved one would receive.
That's great, Mark. What would you say some examples would be of ways that families can effectively support their loved ones after they've chosen the right place, they're residing there? What changes? What should they be trying to do now that they've kind of handed off some of the care needs?
Yeah. No, great question. And I think as much as possible is to frame this simply as a relocation to a new spot, and that all of the kind of previous patterns of visits or calls or interactions, as much as possible, can stay the same in many cases. So if daily visits were always a part of the relationship and that's still physically possible, do it. If it was weekly, do that as well. And certainly there might be some accommodation in that to kind of recognize transition, but as much as possible, trying to keep those routines can be really, really healthy. A couple of things to watch out for that we sometimes see with families as well. One is an approach that tends to be overly rosy and overly positive with this senior who's made a change. It's a big change, right? You may have, in many cases, be leaving a home that you've been in for 60 years, and all of a sudden you're in a new environment. And to not just kind of describe all of that as overly happy and to be overly positive. And certainly it can be, right? But to be very just aware that transitions like that are difficult, and to be able to have some of that conversation. And then we also see the flip side of that. And sometimes that's maybe coming from a guilt feeling as a family member that you had to make a placement because care at home was no longer available. And the conversation can be very apologetic and very negative at times, and kind of that guilt coming out, when in fact, in many of those situations, we see that the person moved in is doing just fine. And they're adjusting, and they're seeing neighbors and friends that they maybe spent their life with, and they're now kind of back in close contact with them. But family members are coming in and kind of expressing those struggles that they're having, and you can have a negative approach. So kind of circling right back to that, I would say just trying to keep that as consistent as possible for what it was previously.
Sure. Oh, that's very insightful. Be careful not to be a wet blanket. Yeah. Good. Let's transition to the next portion of this. So preparing well for yourself. And this question's for Joseph. Why is it crucial for individuals to have an estate plan, power of attorney, healthcare directives, etc., for their own elder care needs in the future?
Yeah, we see this very critical to have your ducks in a row for yourself. And really, it starts with communication. Picking that person that's going to be your executor of your estate, and then communicating with them what your wishes are, and then getting the documents in place. And simple things like having your child go to the bank with you and get their name on the checking account so they can access funds when they're needed. Power of attorney. So the power of attorney is really critical, that if you become incapacitated for any reason, the person you appoint can sign their name for you and act on your legal behalf. And this really became just a heart-wrenching experience this last year for a family we knew, because they had been putting off the documents and putting it off, just not wanting to recognize it. And what happened was they put the mother into a system for memory care. And right at that same time, the father had a heart attack and passed away. So this left the children really in very desperate situation. Since they didn't have the power of attorney, they had to go to the court and they had to get guardianship, and that took months and months, and the funds weren't available, and it's created so much unneeded stress. So living through that experience firsthand, it really has encouraged us to have people see the importance of getting that power of attorney in place. And of course, the other things, the will, the healthcare directive, and if the estate is large enough, a trust might be in store for the family. But just thinking through who's going to be in charge, communicating with them, and then getting the legal documents in place.
It's good to be on top of those things. What I'm hearing you say. Yeah. Joe, what exactly is long-term care insurance? Sometimes that gets confused with long-term disability insurance. What is long-term care insurance, and how can it impact an individual's elder care situation? And is it a good option for everyone?
Yeah, that's a huge topic, Matt. And it used to be called nursing home insurance, and now we call it long-term care because it's more pervasive, and you can shift the risk to the insurance company of the cost of care. And it's been really difficult for the insurance companies because of the tsunami of dementia, and the people that are staying in the nursing home for many, many years, the cost is skyrocketing. And that, coupled with the fact that interest rates had been low for many years, the insurance companies weren't getting the income from their investments, and they're paying more than expected. So the insurance companies in response have been raising the rates year over year. So people that have bought the insurance have been paying more and more and more in premium. So it's been a fairly negative experience. But at the same time, there are policies that are fairly reasonable, and they could provide a blanket to start the funding. And that if you can stay at home and have someone come in and do home health care, that's usually the most desirable thing. And the new policies do help cover that home health person. And then there's assisted living, the next step before you go into skilled care. So there's different types of care and different ways this insurance can be purchased. So the insurance companies have come up with different ways to make it more effective. You can buy like 3 years of policies or 5 years. You can change the amount of coverage you're buying. There's an elimination period, so maybe it's 90 days or half a year before they start paying, and that can lower the cost. There's different ways that it can be more economical to structure the policy to at least get something in place. Most Americans choose to go self-funded, and that can be a scary thing because we don't know what that's going to cost. But yeah, that's one of the things we spend time with our clients, just kind of laying out the options for them, and it depends on their age and their health and who they might have as a caregiver too. So many different factors to look at when considering a long-term care insurance.
Very good. This question is directed for Mark. Mark, what are some strategies folks can use to protect their assets, including their home, from being depleted by nursing home and assisted living expenses? And how does, when people refer to the nursing home coming after my things, what are they getting? What are they talking about?
Yeah. No, some early conversation is good here as well, and kind of in the context of whatever the assets are, to kind of get to the same page with, again, that senior or the family, to be talking about what's our goal here. Are we trying to really looked at how can we gift things away as much as we can? Are we trying to just simply protect the assets? Or are we willing to take a look at a scenario where we are going to deplete the assets to pay for the care of that person? And in some cases, that's probably more of an individual and maybe moral kind of discussion rather than a legal one about kind of who's footing the bill. And at least I believe it's still only true in Minnesota or North Dakota. There's kind of an interesting twist on this. And I'll just lead into this by comparison. I spent many years in the state of Michigan. And as a provider, you make some choices on whether you are going to service a private pay market, those people who are writing their own checks, versus what's typically the state program that's involved the most in our world is Medicaid. And Medicaid, by definition, you pretty much have to be impoverished to qualify for those benefits. But as a provider, you kind of struck out and tried to find a balance of which of those markets were you going to go after, because the state, for the most part, decides what they're going to pay you, and then you structure your business around that. In the private pay side, you decide what your charges are, and you can then create whatever physical environment and whatever amenities and whatever services you would like. And so as a family, you kind of had to decide which of those was going to be your target. In Minnesota and North Dakota, by law, we as operators can only charge private pay individuals the exact same amount that the state pays us for the Medicaid reimbursement. So in essence, if you look at Warroad Senior Living Center, my staff has no idea who pays the bill. For the people in my business office, it doesn't matter who pays the bill, if it's a private situation, an insurance situation, or a Medicaid situation. The rates are exactly the same. And so that's a great consumer protection. And so for people in Warroad or in many rural communities, you're going to end up in the same building, because in many cases, it's the only building in town, one way or another, kind of regardless of your resources. So that goes back to that kind of early talking and early strategizing of what are we going to do here? Are we trying to pass those assets down for kind of generational purposes? Or, we also have people that say, I've worked hard for this money, and we all agree as a family, this is going to take care of me as long as it can. And then we'll go from there at that point.
Very good. Thanks for that insight. Can you share with us, Mark, a process to designating heirlooms and family keepsakes as part of this process? When you get to that phase of life, what about those heirlooms?
Yeah, I'm going to give by example again. I'm going to use my mother, because despite being in this industry for a long time, we just continued to see lots of issues around this. And it wasn't until I had a personal experience that I came up with kind of the process that I think maybe works the best, or at least in our situation it did. But when I would visit my mother, frequently she would begin to show me pieces of jewelry, or my mother is a quilter. And if you know a quilter, those items are as valuable as many other things. And so primarily I'm talking about those types of things, but this could be attached to any heirloom, any asset of any size. But what I would find in talking to my mother is that she had a very specific story behind why she wanted my wife to have this particular ring, because she bought it on a trip to Alaska when we lived in Alaska. And in some cases, she literally had written notes and put in the box of jewelry, kind of with this thought that we'd all be sitting around the dining room table, opening these boxes after her death, and kind of going through this distribution. And as I was talking to my mom, we just kind of stumbled across, why are we waiting? Most of these items are not things that you use on a daily basis. And so let's start talking about, if you want a specific person to have this item, let's do it now. let's have that really meaningful conversation with that person directly about why you want them to have it, why this is important for you. And it created just some wonderful moments as those things were being passed off. And I just thought of the difference between kind of the emotion and the meaning behind that versus kind of a mechanical function of, well, grandma wanted you to have this kind of at the end of her life. And it really turned out to be an incredibly thoughtful thing. My mother did a wonderful job with that. And it, again, may not work in all situations, but kind of that pre-planning, and if possible, that pre-distribution of those items if they're not kind of actively being used.
Wow, that's a great advice, Mark. Let's transition to empowering the next generation. And this question is for Mark. What steps can we take to ensure that our children are well prepared to navigate our elder care process smoothly?
Yeah. Well, again, this one's going to just kind of circle right back to that communication piece, because the thing that you have to really put into perspective is when these conversations are starting to happen, or at least the implementation of some of these plans, it's usually pretty emotional times. And so there's something that's happened. There's been a significant loss in their life. There's been a loss of health. There's maybe been the loss of a spouse that is a caregiver, and all of a sudden you're dealing with some other issues. And rarely are those good times to initiate conversations on planning, whether that's medical or financial. And so as much as possible, finding those moments to find that line between that adult, and maybe at this point I'll assume it's a parent, and the child, in kind of setting up the railings for what this conversation is going to look like. And in some cases, it's full disclosure of, here's what my financial resources are, here's what my medical wishes are, and let's talk about that and be very open with it. In other cases, that's not the family relationship, but at least to say, we're not going to talk about it a lot now, but here's the documents, or here's the people that you need to go talk to if you need this information, so that when it gets down to that time, that as much as possible, you're trying to kind of put a pre-discussed plan in place and not trying to come up with one at that time. Because I think it was Joe that had mentioned, you'd be surprised at the number of times that mom and dad are both going through health issues at the same time. And this kind of progression of, well, this is how we'll do it, all of a sudden is thrown up in the air, and you're just trying to do your best. And without having some of those discussions in advance, it can be really tough. And again, I'll just use one personal example. My father died of cancer, and as a very quiet Norwegian guy who didn't often share a lot of things, once he was diagnosed with cancer, he was very clear with us what his wishes were for kind of financial planning for mom and for us as kids. He was very clear on what his quality of life decisions were going to be as he navigated this cancer journey. And so particularly on the medical side, we got to a point where treatments were not working, and it was kind of this next step of, here's some much more aggressive treatments that we could do. Dad made the decision, that's not for me, that doesn't fit my quality of life. We had some discussions as his children saying, I don't think dad's making the right choice here. But in the end, we once again acknowledged it's his choice, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to support him in that. And to his last day, he kind of directed how that was going to happen, and it made it not easy, but much easier on us as a family when we knew those kinds of things had been expressed in advance.
Very good. Mark, what I heard you say is there's the plans you can put in place, powers of attorney and wills, and then there's the importance of communication. And maybe a way to do that is to have a meeting, a roundtable discussion with the kids, and even a sheet of paper with a listing of, here's who you call to deal with this, here's how you call to deal with that, and just to have a concise document or a meeting of some kind up front is just really invaluable to ease that process.
It really is. And Matt, I appreciate you bringing that portion of it up, because literally down to names and phone numbers in some cases, because even if there's conversations and you generally know who some of the important players are in particularly the financial world or even medical providers, again, in emotional times, in times when you're likely making some of these decisions, the ability to go to a file, to a list, to a piece of paper where some of this is documented is just super helpful to kind of guide that.
Very good. Marco, what would you say is a practical tip to try to minimize potential disagreements and conflict when it comes to the siblings having to work on settling an estate or getting to the end of life?
Yeah. So a couple of things again, and right back to where we started, and it's come up a few times, that communication piece and just engaging in that as early as possible. And then I think there's just a really practical part as well in looking at that in so many cases, if we keep that person in the middle of decision making, and then as much as possible that we don't forget that mom or dad or whoever that senior is can drive most of these decisions and can be a part of that. And then the other piece is that in looking for solutions, sometimes people get really hung up on the perfect solutions versus just a good, reasonable, well thought out solution, because oftentimes, just like the rest of life, there isn't a perfect answer. And the search for perfect can cause a lot of stress and cause a lot of issues amongst family members who are trying to get on the same page. But again, going back to typically a very emotional time, and just realizing that just like all of us, sometimes we make good decisions, other times we don't. And sometimes that's intentional, right? I think there's many times that I've made decisions that I know probably were riskier than they should have been, or those types of things, but that's part of life. And as it relates to some of these planning issues, again, or the disagreements that can sometimes come up with family members, just really looking at talk about things, keep that family member in the middle of things, and then really look for kind of the ability to get to good, solid, well thought out decisions, but not perfect decisions.
Very good, Mark. Joe, this last question is for you. What are some effective ways to help prepare and educate your children to handle their future inheritance? Oh, Joe, can't hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really a great question, and one I've thought about a lot. And there's a situation in America where most Americans die in their 80s and they leave their money to their kids in their 60s when it's too late to really make an impact. So I really would like to encourage people to think about early giving when their kids are in their 30s, and it really could make an impact on those families. So the timing of the gift is one thing to think about. And again, it comes down to communication and setting values. And it's not just about transferring the dollars, it's transferring the values and the life perspective. And really educating your kids through helping them understand what's important to you, and then demonstrating it and then modeling it so that they can carry it out. And things like doing giving together, having some charities that you believe in together to support, like maybe go on a mission trip together and see the work being done firsthand and then be involved financially. Just learning about the flow of generosity and how that can be a blessing. So yeah, I think the Bible talks a lot about people leaving an inheritance for your grandchildren, thinking about educating your grandkids. There's just so many opportunities to make an impact if you think about it, be intentional, and plan ahead. So.
Very good. At this time, we'll open it up for Q&A. There's a little box at the bottom of your screen with a Q&A. I'll pull that screen share back up so you can see what that looks like. Right here. Very good. Okay. Okay, I have one question that came in. So we'll direct this question to Mark. At what age should we start the conversation about our finances and where our assets are?
I think I'm going to say the earlier the better, and that can make it really tough. But again, if there's an openness to that understanding of where those assets are from an earlier time. So again, maybe generally to start saying, it's something to look at in that senior 60s and mid 60s. But, as we know, right, anything can happen at any point in time. And we tend to plan, and especially in our environment, we look at most of the people in our world are 85 years old. And so kind of the off the top of my head conversation, it's like, well, do it when you're 80 because you got a few years to have this conversation. But there's just many times where things change, and God's plan is different than what we think it can be at any given age. And so the earlier those conversations can happen, the earlier people can understand the scope, the size, the plans for those resources, the better it is.
This question I'll direct to Joe. What can you do to prepare if you don't have kids to help you?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of, what are the resources available to you? And we've talked a little bit about long-term care insurance and preparing financially and having a trustee, or is there a friend or someone you can put in place as an executor to take care of your estate? So just thinking through who might be there that you could rely on to build a team to help you and support you through that.
I'll direct this question to Joe as well. From an emotional perspective, does it make a difference if we start the home selling process at the same time as our parent would enter a nursing home, or would it be better to wait until they are settled to sell the home, or maybe even if it's at the end of life to sell the home after they've passed?
Yeah, there's a few huge milestones. I think of, giving up the driving in the car is a huge one. And then the home that they've had for decades and decades, because it represents so many memories. And each situation is different. And if the loved one is really okay with it going, then selling it early might be just fine. But if it is an emotional landmark for them, maybe keeping it longer is okay. So yeah, it's really hard to answer that without knowing the specifics of the family and what the finances are and how that's going to go about. And sometimes we see unrealistic expectations that they want to save it for the children and the children aren't interested. So it's all that kind of processing and communication again.
Yeah. If I could chime in on that, Joe,
Yes.
I think you really nailed that. But I look at people who move into our world, assisted living and whatever, and that home is so much more than whatever the value of it is as it relates to paying bills. All of their family memories in many cases are wrapped up into that. Some people are just ready to make that transition. It's easier to not have that as an option and to not be looking at that. Others, that is that last thing that they're holding on to. And sometimes idealistically thinking they're going to return there when they're not. But many times, even if they're very aware that they are not going to be returning to that home, knowing that it's there, knowing that there's familiarity there is just something that gives people a real sense of peace. And it's just such an individual thing, and it's hard to figure out. But it's that relationship part of, even with the house, that is often driving.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Thank you both so much for your time, expertise, and that's just been a huge blessing to all of us listening. There will be a resource page going out to everybody who signed up, and so please be on the lookout for an email with not only a recording of this, but also some other resources that might be of help. I also want to just remind all of you too that we want to be a resource to your friends and family. And so if there are any questions that come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd be glad to hear from you.